In this segment, we're going to be talking about the use of a remote starter or bump switch. Now, we're going to hook this particular switch up to the starter, usually the S or trigger wire, and to a positive battery terminal. And that's going to give us the ability to, when we hit this button, crank the engine over without having to use the key. This can come in very handy to speed up a compression test, or perhaps do a cylinder leak down test, anything that requires us to turn the engine over without having to go in and bump the key every time. It also saves trying to find some help in the shop. If you want to be under the hood while the engine's cranking over, you could always get somebody to help you run the key, but this is much simpler. It only takes one person. Also, a lot of modern cars with the push button start. That's hard to bump that engine over just a little bit. We can bump or jog the engine over a little bit at a time when we hook up a remote starter switch. Okay. So again, we only have two wires here. One is going to go to a battery positive source. The other one is going to go to the starter trigger or S terminal. Now, where we access that, we'll talk about that in a minute. Sometimes we'll go straight to the starter. It's the easiest spot. Sometimes we'll find another place to access it. I'll also take you out in the shop and we'll take a look at a couple of engines out in the engine pen on this. Comes in very handy. Also, when we're using one of these, keep some jumper wires handy. These big old clips, that big old clip right there, that big old clip can't go in the same places that that clip can. Okay. See those two? So sometimes we'll use this to get close to the starter, and then we'll take the other end and hook that up to our remote start to make an easier connection. So if we're going to use one of these, before you even start, have a couple of these on hand to help yourself out. Now a bit of caution. Never, 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 ever hit this button until you've ensured that the vehicle is in park or neutral, the parking brake is set, and the wheels are chalked. Okay? Make sure those three things have happened. Okay. And preferably, unless you're checking for a no start where you want to see if there's spark, fuel, whatnot, if we're doing compression tests, CLT, checking the starter, relative compression, something like that, probably good to have the key off. If that vehicle is in gear and that ignition key is on and you hit that button, that engine could then start. Once that engine starts, at that point in time, if it's in gear, where it's going to go, that can get real dangerous real quick. So again, before you hit this button, vehicle is in park or neutral, parking brake is set, wheels are chalked at a minimum. All right. Now we'll head out in the shop in a minute. I'm going to show you some examples of connecting this. Something else you could think about doing is pulling a wiring diagram of the circuit and looking at it ahead of time so that we can figure out where we might go to hook this up before we've even opened the hood or looked at the car. I'll give you an example of that in just a second. So here we have a wiring diagram off of a newer Toyota Corolla. Now we're going to look to hook up our remote starter, or bump starter. So I'm going to need to be both at my main terminal here. Here's my battery. Here's my starter. I need to be across my main terminal or power here and my start terminal. We often call that the S terminal or the little wire. It's actually labeled B on this one. So I need to jump across those two places to get this to crank over. Now, I don't have to be right here and right here. I can be anywhere in either one of those circuits and make it happen. That starter happens to be a little bit buried in this car, so I'm not necessarily going to go there right away unless it happens to be the easiest spot to access. This terminal, that battery is much easier to get to than it is there at the starter. So I'm going to pick off one lead right up here. Now, my little wire, what we'd call the S terminal, again labeled B in this instance, I'm going to look for an easier place to get in on that one. I have two connectors back here. A quick bit of digging in the wiring diagram shows me that both of those connectors are kind of buried. Neither one's really easy to get to, so I'm going to have to pick somewhere else. The ignition switch itself, if I want to access the wiring for that, I have to tear the shrouding off of the steering column. It's a little more time consuming than I'm willing to spend to hook up a remote starter. The starter relay, however, happens to be in a relay box underneath the dash, reasonably accessible. If I pop this starter relay out and I hit this thing right here on this terminal, that's feeding the circuit. I already have one lead hooked up here. If I pull this relay out and I hook a T-pin or a jumper wire in here and I connect to this, I now have made my connection from here to here. I can use my remote starter and didn't spend a lot of time to get there. It's always worth spending a few minutes to look at a wiring diagram to see if there's some easier spots that we can hook up instead of going straight to the starter itself. Now let's head out in the shop and take a look at actually hooking this thing up on some engines. We're going to talk about the use of a remote starter. Why? Lots of reasons. But right now we're going to illustrate the hookups for this remote starter. So the first hookup I'm going to illustrate is directly at the starter. So we have our main power coming in. We have our S terminal right here, our start terminal. Now, okay, if we look in the diagram for this, it may not be labeled an S. But essentially, we have big wire, that's going to be our power. Little wire, that's going to be our trigger. I want to crank this over with the use of a remote starter. So I need to hook it up to the trigger when it's disconnected and main power. So to make this simple, I'm going to unhook that. I'm going to go ahead and use a jumper wire to get in on that terminal to make it easy. I'm going to hook up that to my remote starter one lead. I'm going to go ahead and hook the other lead here. Now, this is an easy to get to starter out in the engine pen. What I would have to be much more careful about in a lot of applications, in the vehicle, the actual terminal here and our main power can be very close together. So it's very easy to short or jump across the two just on hookup, which will cause this to crank over. But now I have one of my leads to my remote starter hooked here to the trigger, one to power. So if I did this right, we crank over. So that's one way to do it. Now when I'm done, we're going to disconnect the main power. We're going to disconnect here and here. And most importantly, we're going to remember to hook this back up. I'll be honest with you, what happens often in the shop is we jump back in the car, we hit the key, and then we realize we never hooked this back up. Now, this is easy to get to. We're out in the engine pen right now. This is nice and simple. In the shop, it's not going to be that way. In the shop, we're going to have this sucker much more difficult to get at. It's under the car most of the time, might even be inside an intake manifold. Probably not going to go this procedure there. But under the car, somewhere else, a lot harder to get to. Now we got to stop, re-access it so we can come back and plug it in. So when you're done, just make sure to plug that back in. Very important note. Make sure before you hit this button that the vehicle is in neutral or park and the parking brake is set. Okay? Crucial. If you goof and the key is on and that vehicle is not on park or neutral and you hit this button, that thing could start and take off and do some serious damage, so be quite cautious with that. For our next connection, I've moved over in the engine pen, come over to one of our Pontiacs over here, our Solstice. Now I'm going to take a different tact on this one. Let's see, the starter is... Okay, even though we're in the engine pen, this starter is a bit more difficult to access. And I'm feeling kind of lazy. So, I've come down here to the junction block, which conveniently being in the engine pen, we have the interior labeling for it right here. And I've noticed that relay 34, it's that guy right there, says crank. Now I already consulted a wiring diagram. I already know that this feeds the starter. So I can pull that relay out. And yes, I've already identified which pin I need. I'm going to grab my T pin here. This is going to be pin 87 of that guy. One to power. One to pin 87, which feeds directly to the starter S terminal or trigger wire. Let's give it a try. Okay, pretty simple, and I didn't have to get all the way down to the starter. And once again, when we're all done, we remember to put everything back just as we found it. Last but not least, I've come over to, yes, a Ford. I have to show you this. It's a Ford. You're going to work on these a lot, you know, unless you're going to work for an import-only shop. You want to work on Fords, make lots of money. Anyway, so we're come over to our Ford now. I want to show you one of these pro tips on a Ford. Old Fords were really great for hooking up these remote starters. They put a starter solenoid right on an inner fender, super easy to get to. You pop the hood, both your wires right there clipped up, and you could crank that sucker over. Well, later years they've gotten rid of them. And on a lot of these vehicles, they don't necessarily have an accessible or separate starter relay. But what a lot of Fords do have, if you look near the main battery cable, a lot of times you'll see a connector, single wire. Now, once again, I've already checked the wiring diagram, and I know that red and blue feeds my starter trigger or S terminal. I've already identified that this is the one that goes into the battery harness that goes down to the starter. So now, grab my jumper wire. I'm going to connect there. I'm going to connect one there. And I'm going to connect one there. And we work. All right? Great tip if you're working on a Ford. They still made it easy to hook up a remote starter.